You think anger takes control from you. It does not. You hand it control the moment you agree with it. The surge comes fast. Heat in the chest. Tightness in the jaw. A sentence forms before you examine it: this should not be happening. That sentence is not the anger. It is the judgment beneath it. And once that judgment is accepted without resistance, authority has already shifted. Anger feels like an invasion. But the event did not enter your ruling faculty. It only presented an impression. The movement that followed was not forced. It was permitted. Not consciously perhaps, but structurally. The mind did not stop at appearance. It endorsed it. This is where the confusion begins. You do not lose authority when anger appears. You lose it when you stop distinguishing between what appears and what you accept as true. The reaction itself is not yet surrender. The agreement with it is. So the problem is not that anger exists. The problem is that it is treated as a verdict instead of an impression. And once treated as a verdict, it begins to command speech, action, and posture as if it were justified authority. The task is not to suppress the feeling, nor to excuse it. The task is to locate the moment where agreement occurs, and refuse to give it without examination. Observe where the impression ends and your consent begins. The first mistake is not the anger. It is what you assume anger allows you to do. You feel the surge and immediately move as if permission has already been granted. Voice sharpens. Thought narrows. The mind stops examining and starts executing. But no external force issued that command. The impression arrived. Then something else happened. You agreed with it. Authority is not taken in that moment. It is reassigned. What belongs to you remains unchanged even under pressure. Judgment, assent, choice, use of impressions. These do not disappear because the body reacts. They are still present, but they are bypassed. You do not lose them. You stop using them. What does not belong to you also remains unchanged. The other person's behavior, the event, the words spoken, the tone delivered. None of these enter your control. Yet anger often begins with an attempt to seize them, to correct them, to reverse them, to punish them. This is where confusion multiplies. You try to act where you have no authority, and neglect the place where you do. The boundary is simple, but it is rarely held. You cannot command the event. You cannot rewrite what has already occurred. You cannot install your judgment inside another mind. But you can examine the impression that arrives when these things happen. You can refuse immediate agreement. You can pause before endorsement. When this boundary collapses, anger becomes justification. Not just a feeling, but a license. A signal that something must be done outwardly, immediately, forcefully. But that signal is not neutral. It carries a judgment: this is wrong and must be corrected now. That judgment is not the event. It is your addition. And once that addition is accepted, the rest follows automatically. So the real loss is not calm. It is clarity of ownership. You begin to treat what is not yours as if it were. And treat what is yours as if it were already decided. This is why anger escalates so quickly. Not because it is strong, but because it is rarely examined before being obeyed. To hold authority, you must re-establish the boundary before action begins. Not after the damage. Not after the words. Before assent completes its movement. The impression says, "This is intolerable." You must ask, "Is that true, or is that my judgment?" The impression says, "They have wronged me." You must ask, "What exactly has been taken from me that belongs to my ruling faculty?" The impression says, "I must respond now." You must ask, "Who issued that necessity?" These questions are not delays. They are restorations of control. Without them, anger moves unchecked because it has been mistaken for authority itself. But anger does not carry authority. It borrows it. And it borrows it from you. The moment you see that, the sequence changes. The impression still arrives. The body still reacts. But the chain does not complete. Agreement is interrupted. And without agreement, anger cannot command. That interruption is not weakness. It is the return of governance. Hold the boundary. Reclaim the point of assent. That is where authority remains. The impression arrives first. Always. Before speech. Before action. Before escalation. It appears as a complete statement. This is disrespect. This is unacceptable. This should not happen. It does not announce itself as interpretation. It presents itself as fact. That is where the danger begins. Because the mind rarely pauses at the level of appearance. It moves immediately to agreement. Not examined. Not tested. Accepted. And once accepted, the structure is already in place. Impression becomes judgment. Judgment becomes position. Position demands action. This entire sequence can occur in seconds. Sometimes faster than you can describe it. But speed does not remove responsibility. It only hides the moment where responsibility operates. You do not choose the arrival of the impression. But you do participate in what follows it. The critical point is not the feeling. It is the transition. There is a gap. Small. Often ignored. But structurally present. In that gap, the mind either withholds agreement or grants it. If it withholds, the impression remains provisional. It has not yet shaped your response. It has not yet defined the situation. It is still under review. If it grants agreement, the impression hardens. It becomes truth in the system. And once treated as truth, it directs behavior without resistance. This is assent. And assent is where anger becomes action. Not because anger forces it, but because it is now endorsed as correct. Consider the difference carefully. The feeling may rise without permission, but the conclusion does not. The conclusion, "This justifies my reaction," is added. And once added, the rest feels necessary. This is why people say, "I couldn't help it." What they mean is not that no control existed. It is that the moment of control was bypassed too quickly to notice. But the structure remains the same. Impression. Interpretation. Assent. Action. Remove one element, and the chain weakens. Remove assent, and the chain breaks. This does not eliminate the feeling. It changes its authority. Without assent, anger remains a signal. With assent, it becomes a command. And most of the damage attributed to anger does not come from the signal. It comes from the command that follows agreement. So the task is not to prevent impressions. That is not possible. The task is to slow the movement from impression to assent. Not by force. By examination. When the impression says, "This is intolerable," you do not suppress it. You hold it. You question its claim to truth. When it says, "They have insulted me," you examine what exactly has been touched. Your body? Your judgment? Or your image? When it says, "Respond now," you ask whether urgency is real or assumed. This is not hesitation. It is filtration. Without this filtration, every impression becomes a directive. With it, impressions lose their automatic authority. And this is where discipline begins. Not in controlling emotion, but in controlling agreement. If you can delay assent, even briefly, you reinsert authority into the process. The feeling remains, but it no longer governs. And once it no longer governs, it can no longer claim that it took control from you. Because it never did. It was given control. And what is given can be withheld. Understanding the mechanism does not correct it. Seeing the sequence does not yet interrupt it. You can describe impression, judgment, assent, and still submit to them without resistance. This is where discipline enters. Not as force. Not as suppression. As training of the moment where agreement occurs. Discipline is not what you do at the peak of anger. It is what you have practiced before the peak arrives. Because once the surge is fully formed, the mind is already under pressure. And pressure favors habit, not intention. So the question is not whether you know the structure. The question is whether you have trained your response to it. Most people wait for anger to appear, then try to control it. This fails. Not because control is impossible, but because they are attempting intervention after assent has already been given. Once assent is complete, the direction is set. The body follows. The speech follows. The posture follows. At that point, you are not choosing. You are executing. Discipline must move earlier. It must operate at the edge of impression, before agreement hardens. This requires repetition, not intensity. You do not train this once. You train it in small, repeated exposures, minor irritations, delays, interruptions, disagreements that do not yet carry full emotional charge. These are not insignificant. They are the training ground. When a small inconvenience appears, the same structure is present. The same sequence begins. The same opportunity exists. Impression, this is annoying. Interpretation, this should not be happening. Assent, agreement or refusal. If you allow automatic agreement in small moments, you are rehearsing surrender for larger ones. If you interrupt agreement in small moments, you are building resistance for larger ones. This is why discipline is not dramatic. It is repetitive. It is the act of noticing the impression and delaying its promotion to truth. Again. And again. And again. Not perfectly. But consistently. You will fail. Often. Assent will slip through. Reaction will occur. Words will be spoken before examination. This does not invalidate the practice. It reveals where it is not yet stable. The error is not failure. The error is failing without review. If you do not return to the moment afterward and examine where assent occurred, the pattern remains unchanged. Discipline includes correction after the fact. You reconstruct the sequence. You identify where the impression was accepted. You see the exact point where authority was handed over. Not to blame. To refine. Over time, this changes the timing. The gap becomes more visible. The pause becomes more accessible. The agreement becomes less automatic. You begin to feel the impression without immediately endorsing it. This is not emotional numbness. It is structural control. The feeling still arrives. But it no longer carries unquestioned authority. And this is the shift. You are no longer trying to eliminate anger. You are training your relation to it. From obedience to examination. From automatic agreement to deliberate consent. This is discipline. Not harshness toward yourself. Not resistance to feeling. Precision at the point of assent. Because that is where authority is either maintained or surrendered. And that point can be trained. You do not wait for anger to teach you what to do. You decide in advance how you will meet the impression. Not in theory. In action. When the signal appears, the first move is not reaction. It is naming. This is an impression. Not a verdict. Not a command. An appearance. This single act creates distance. Small, but sufficient. It prevents immediate fusion between what appears and what you accept. Without this step, the sequence runs uninterrupted. After naming, you do not argue with the feeling. You examine the claim inside it. What is this saying? Usually it carries a demand. This should not be happening. This is wrong. This must be corrected now. You isolate that demand. Then you test it. Is this within my control? If the answer is no, and it usually is, then the demand loses authority. Not because the situation improves, but because the claim exceeds your jurisdiction. This is not passivity. It is accurate placement of effort. If you proceed without this test, you act under false authority. You attempt to correct what is not yours. And frustration compounds. So the sequence becomes operational. When anger appears, name it as impression. When the claim appears, isolate it. When the demand forms, test it against control. If it fails the test, you do not obey it. You return to what remains yours. Judgment. Assent. Response. Then you choose the smallest possible action that does not require surrender of authority. Sometimes that action is silence. Sometimes it is delay. Sometimes it is a measured response stripped of excess judgment. But it is never automatic discharge. Because automatic discharge is the mark of completed assent. Another operation follows after the moment passes. Review. Not emotional replay. Structural review. Where did the impression arrive? What did it claim? Where did I agree? You reconstruct the sequence without excuse. If you reacted, you do not justify it. You locate the exact point where agreement occurred too quickly. This sharpens the next encounter. Without review, experience does not convert into discipline. With review, each failure becomes instruction. There is also a preventive operation. Anticipation. Not anxiety. Preparation. You identify situations where anger is likely. Not to avoid them. To preload your response. You decide beforehand. When this happens, I will treat the first impression as unverified. This removes surprise. And surprise is often what accelerates assent. Prepared attention slows the sequence. And slowing the sequence restores authority. None of this removes the feeling. The body will still react. The surge will still occur. But the chain will not complete automatically. That is the difference. Anger without examination leads to action without authority. Anger with examination becomes information without command. The practice is not complex. But it is exact. Name the impression. Examine the claim. Test the demand. Withhold agreement when it exceeds your control. Return to what is yours. Review after. Repeat. This is how authority is maintained in motion. Not by eliminating anger. By refusing to let it decide. What changes is not the world. Not people. Not provocation. What changes is where authority remains when pressure rises. Before discipline, anger feels like displacement. Something takes over. Something pushes you into reaction. Something reduces your range of choice. But that description hides the structure. Nothing takes authority. Authority is transferred. And once you see that, the goal shifts. You are not trying to become a person who never feels anger. That would be a misunderstanding of the system. Impressions will continue. Reactions will still arise. The body will still register disturbance. The question is narrower. More exact. Does the feeling pass through you, or does it recruit you? If it recruits you, it does so through agreement. Not force. If it passes through, it does so because agreement was withheld. This is what freedom becomes. Not calm. Not comfort. Not a life without friction. Freedom is the condition where impressions do not automatically become commands. Where the mind is no longer obligated to obey what appears. Where reaction is no longer identical with action. This does not make life easier. It makes your position within it more stable. Events remain unstable. People remain unpredictable. Outcomes remain outside your command. But the inner sequence becomes less easily captured. You begin to notice the early movement. The first tightening. The first interpretation. The first push toward agreement. And in that early movement, you retain access. You can still choose. Not perfectly. Not every time. But more often than before. And that difference accumulates. Because each moment where assent is withheld weakens the illusion that anger must be obeyed. Each interruption reduces its authority. Each examined impression loses its claim to immediate truth. Over time, this changes your relation to conflict. You are not slower because you are passive. You are slower because you are not submitting automatically. You are not quieter because you are suppressing. You are quieter because you are not granting false urgency. You are not detached because you do not care. You are detached because you no longer confuse appearance with fact. This is not visible as performance. It does not look impressive from the outside. There is no signal that announces, authority has been maintained. But internally, the difference is exact. You are no longer carried by the first interpretation. You are no longer compelled by the first reaction. You are no longer obligated to defend every impression that appears. This is stability, not the absence of disturbance, the reduction of surrender. But this stability is not permanent. It does not install itself once and remain. Every new impression reopens the possibility of agreement. Every new reaction reintroduces the chance of surrender. So freedom is not something you achieve and keep. It is something you maintain. Through the same process. Again. Name the impression. Examine the claim. Test the demand. Withhold agreement where it exceeds your authority. Return to what is yours. This repetition is not a burden. It is the condition of sovereignty. Without it, authority drifts outward. Toward events. Toward people. Toward reactions. With it, authority remains located where it always belonged. Not in what happens, but in how you assent to what appears. And that is the only place it has ever been. Anger is not the problem. The problem is the authority you assign to it once it appears. The event did not force your reaction. The impression did not complete the sequence. What completed it was agreement. And that agreement remains within your control, even when it feels immediate. This is the correction. You are not trying to become immune to anger. You are not trying to remove disturbance from life. You are correcting where authority is placed when disturbance arises. If authority is given to the impression, reaction becomes inevitable. If authority remains with judgment, reaction becomes optional. This distinction is not theoretical. It is operational. It determines whether anger directs you or passes through you. Every moment of anger reopens the same structure. An appearance arrives. A claim forms. A demand follows. And then a decision is made, whether you notice it or not. To agree. Or to examine. If you agree without examination, you convert feeling into command. You act as if the impression has already been verified. And once verified, it governs you. If you examine, you interrupt that conversion. The feeling remains, but it does not escalate into authority. It stays what it is, an impression awaiting judgment. This is where responsibility lies. Not in preventing what you feel. Not in controlling what others do. In governing what you accept as true. This governance is not loud. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It happens in small moments. Quiet interruptions. Brief refusals to agree too quickly. But those moments determine everything that follows. Because once assent is given, the rest unfolds automatically. And once it is withheld, the structure changes. So the task remains consistent. Do not rush to obey the first interpretation. Do not treat the feeling as a verdict. Do not surrender authority at the moment of pressure. Return to the point where agreement is made. Hold it there. Examine it. And only then decide. Return to what is yours to govern.